way over time, apologies. I don't want to lose the opportunity for all of us just to pose some questions, perhaps some comments to Jane. If you can just identify yourself, please, gentlemen.
In this regard, what I'm saying is our contemporary discussion in South Africa, so political dialogue, is so far off the tracks with regard to what you've been talking about most eloquently in the current dispensation, under the current ANC administration, and with regard to service to citizens and 6 million jobs. You say you can't just expand the public sector and you can't resolve problems through social grants. Please describe to me why then problems in Madagascar are resolved ostensibly, but Robert Mugabe enters his 7th term and more than 30th year in power, and we are his direct neighbour.
I'm not a politician. The problems of solving the political challenges, and whether those are Swaziland or Zimbabwe or the DRC, are a lot more complex than we like to think. And we must understand that complexity. I think one of the things about our history is that we're very averse to interventionist politics. And that's because of our history. South African politics under apartheid was incredibly interventionist, almost bombing other countries that they felt were harboring the ANC. So part of it is the sort of history of the liberation movement today, which is what the ANC and the majority party in government is, has been an aversion towards intervention in other countries. Secondly, it's like, some of these countries are run by people who have been allies in the days of our struggle for freedom. It's not very easy, even if your ally in the past is doing something wrong, to then suddenly turn on them. So I think that's a second issue that we have to deal with. And thirdly, I think that it's like a difference in approach between people who are inside the country and outside the country. If you look at Cosato's views, have been very explicit on issues of Zimbabwe or Swaziland. That's our view. If you ask me my personal view, I think that it's outrageous that the monarch of Swaziland continues to oppress his people and think that he has some divine power from above to rule Swaziland. And we should be unambiguous in our position, in our foreign policy around that. But I cannot answer for the foreign policy of government. I'm not in government anymore. I think we should have a more robust position on what happens in Africa on the issue of human rights and the rule of law. I think we should take a position, a stronger position in the African Union about an assertion of people's fundamental democratic and civil rights. But, politics, not just in Africa, but in many parts of the world, comes in between that. So, I think that's why I talk about, the development paradigm is influenced by two factors: what governments do and what we do, what the private sector does, and the type of supply side measures that you put into place. And the other thing is demands of citizens. The citizens of South Africa stood up and said, we want a more aggressive policy on human rights, and we want the ruling party or the political parties to take a stronger position on that. Then they will have no alternative, because they will have to come back to us and ask for our vote. So it depends to the extent to which people are organized. No one won our struggle for freedom in South Africa. We won it ourselves by organizing ourselves against tremendous odds. I cannot solve Zimbabwe's problems if Zimbabwean people themselves are not organizing themselves to fight for their freedom. So I think that in a sense, our intervention in other countries is always in support of people's basic assertion that they're entitled to human rights, but they have to fight those battles. We cannot fight it for them.
You spoke about interstate and intrastate conflicts, and whilst interstate conflicts on the continent on the decline, intrastate conflicts, more so in South Africa, are on the increase. Examples: ANC and its partners, tensions between institutions and states, corruption, and. How much of a risk is intrastate politics currently in South Africa a risk to local and international business, and particularly international investors?
Well, an intrastate conflicts, I don't think I was talking about South Africa. I'm making reference to what's happening in places like the Central African Republic, what's happening in South Sudan, what happened in Cote d'Ivoire, what's happening in Mali. Those are big interest rate battles which set back development across the board by decades, on average 2.5 decades. I think what you have in South Africa is a robustness, and I think it's a robustness of a political environment that still works. Institutions still work. The public protector is still going to produce a report. But I think what is very important is to make sure that the institutional integrity of the state is defended. And I think that that there's some crossing of lines there, because the integrity of the institution is as good as the people who lead it. So when we designed the dispensation, one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, the one that set a Bill of Rights that gave you second and third generation rights, not just access to education, access to quality education, access to water, the right to water, and sanitation, and refuse removal. And I think part of it is saying, how do citizens organize themselves to make sure those rights that we won through struggle and we enshrined in the Constitution are now implemented in practice, so that we don't have a Bekkersdorp, that we don't have a Marikana, that we don't have a Prince. So part of it is about what needs to happen. And I think there's still a robustness within South Africa that will make sure that those issues are brought onto the agenda. But I think one of the weaknesses that I see in South Africa today is that the lack of organization, because it looks like most of civil society, including the trade union movement, are more focused on what's happening up there in politics rather than what's happening on the ground. So that when you have a situation where service delivery does not work, like when I went to Bekkersdorp to talk to people that were leading the protests there, and they were very legitimate protests because there was raw sewage in the streets. The refuse removal hadn't been collected in weeks. Now, when I chaired the Development Bank of Southern Africa, we had a team of 600 project managers and engineers. It would have taken a week to go and sort that problem out. The question is, if leaders are not listening to people on the ground who have genuine grievances, and if the people are not organized themselves to understand that they have to build power, have a set of demands, and then negotiate, what happens is that violence happens. Because violence becomes a language that gets leaders to listen. And that's so dangerous for a society. When people feel so frustrated that their genuine grievances are not being attended to, they end up burning a school or a public building, just to draw attention to their grievances. That's a failure of governance. And that's what we need to correct, before it gets more serious. So I think people are absolutely entitled by the Constitution to protest about rights that they have in the Constitution that they're not getting. But you've got to organize themselves in a way that makes sure that you hold whoever is the leader accountable. So whether it's your leader in the trade union movement, or it's your leader in civil society, or the leaders in politics, you've got to hold them accountable. And one last point I'm going to tell you on governance. South Africa, from 2000 to, we've been measuring in the Modi Bryan Foundation's governance across the board in terms of 94 indicators of governance. And we've been measuring that for the last 13 years. So if you look at the budget of South Africa in 2000, it was probably around 233 billion rand. And if you look at the budget in 2013, it was 1.1 trillion rand. So we've almost quadrupled the budget, public budget, for the delivery of public goods. Public goods meaning water and electricity and sanitation and refuse removal and health. But if you look at the average of improvement in governance across Africa. That is improved by close to 5 points. We measure out 100 points. Close to 5 points. Even if you include the Somalias and the DRCs and the Central African Republic. In South Africa, with quadrupling of our budget, our governance has improved about 0.6%. So now we've got to ask a more fundamental question. Is what is the quality of expenditure and what is the outcome of that expenditure in improving the quality of life of our citizens? And I think that the next conversation we've got to be having in South Africa is about performance. It's about efficiency, and it's about the outcomes that determine whether a society is succeeding or not. So that 500,000 children don't drop out of education before they get to matric. That the people, that 50% of the young people that pass matric have skills that they can either create their own livelihood, and don't end up in a scenario where they have very few skills, no job, and unlikely to have a job in their lifetime. I think that's our challenge in the country. Thank you.
Jay, as you say, we're in a first world, Santon's first world and developing world wrap effectively, and that's not sustainable. Jay passed on this from the 2013 Abraham Forum Facts and Figures, Africa ahead of the next 50 years. I suggest you download it from the website. Really, really good report. Jay, thank you very, very much for that, and so much more.